Welcome everyone to lecture 5 of module 1. So this lecture continues with our earlier discussion on the transition from neoclassical school of thought to environmental economics. And today we will focus specifically on the evolution of ecological economics and how ecological economics emerged and how it fundamentally redefines the economy environment relationship. But the first thing that we will do is let's quickly take a recap of what we have so far discussed. So if you remember, we discussed in our first few lectures that almost all the classical economists, be it Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, Mill, they recognize limits to growth, right, based on either land scarcity, population pressure, capital accumulation, but they always recognize that there is a limit to growth. However, if you look at neoclassical economics that we discussed, they assume that there is no limit to growth. And the reason is that they had a lot of faith on technology as well as the market. And so they felt that they basically assumed, or most of their theories were around that in the long run, since we are all dead, so in the short run, there will be no limit to growth. Then we spoke about environmental economics, where the focus was mostly on externalities. And they believe that growth can continue if environmental costs are priced. So from limits to growth to no limits, we finally discussed about pricing solutions. Okay. Now let's discuss about, growth versus degradation. So we have been talking about that the entire understanding of, economic growth is around the fact that, economic growth brings in poverty reduction. It basically helps in bringing better technology, better infrastructure. It also helps you in higher per capita income. But we also has a problem, and that problem is that all of these growth comes at a cost, and that cost is the degradation of natural capital. So while growth is necessary, but it is also creating ecological stress. And if you look at developing countries, they still need growth. They still need to eradicate their poverty. They still need to ensure that the infrastructure gaps are taken care of. But despite having so much of growth, we still see that there is hunger, poverty, lack of infrastructure, and even poor access to very basic needs such as access to water. So because of this, we continuously talk about more and more growth, because the overarching priority for developing countries has remained that economic growth will help us to overcome these concerns. The poverty alleviation particularly is the fundamental reason. The challenge today is how to, and so basically this creates a policy tension as well. And the key challenge today is that how to integrate natural capital into development, because we cannot ignore poverty. We also cannot ignore environmental limits. And, this is exactly where ecological economics comes in, that, how can we mainstream the natural capital as well? Now let's understand, what is ecological economics. So, first of all, what is very interesting to understand is that ecological economics actually aims to bring economy and ecology together. It aims to bridge the gap which has resulted in degradation of ecology while we talk about economic growth. So it also aims to bring natural and social sciences together. And while doing so, we therefore say that ecological economics is a transdisciplinary field, because it does not just stick to economics, it goes beyond one discipline such as economics. So it's very important to therefore understand that it actually tries to bridge the existing gap or the existing policy tension that we see between environment or between ecology and the economic growth. And it also tries to answer how can economy function within the ecological limits. So in today's lecture, we will first try to explore the evolution of ecological economics. And then eventually in the next lecture, we will move to the foundational vision. What was the core concept around ecological economics? Okay, let us begin by discussing the beginning of the ecological economic era. So as you see in this slide basically explains how ecological economics emerged as a field and why it was needed. So the idea of ecological economics, or I would say the idea of environment, the idea of that we need to bridge the gap between economy and environment actually started in 1960s and 70s. And if you remember, we discussed this when we spoke about environmental economics, that there was a lot of noise around the impact of economic growth and environment. But at the time in 60s to 70s, ecological economics had not become a formal academic discipline, and that actually happened quite late in 1989. So first, it was an intellectual development and then an institutional recognition. Now let's look at some of the key thinkers and their contribution, which basically helped in giving a shape to this discipline as ecological economics. Now, some of the things that we will discuss here may become maybe a bit difficult for you to understand, but we will deal with these more in detail in the subsequent lectures. So first, let's look at Kenneth Boulding. He used a concept called spaceship Earth in 1966. And why do we consider Kenneth Boulding's concept of spaceship Earth as very important concept for ecological economics? Because the core idea behind his spaceship Earth was that economy cannot expand endlessly because it operates within a closed spaceship, which have finite resources. So like in a spaceship, you will always have finite resources, and once you exhaust them, there will be nothing left for you to survive. So it basically says that waste absorption is also limited because it has a limited space. So whatever you do when within an Earth system, you have to remember that it is a closed spaceship. You cannot keep on bringing new things into it because the resources are finite. So remember, this is one of the fundamental thing of ecological economics as well. The next was Nicholas Gorgescu-Roegen, who actually was a physicist, and he applied the thermodynamics to economics. And that what he applied is also known as entropy law. And he basically showed that economic processes, every economic process, everything that we produce uses energy and also a lot of material irreversibly, meaning you actually change the order. The moment you use resource, for example, if you use a tree to make a table out of it, you have actually changed a very low order, low entropy, which is tree, which actually does not, emit a lot of energy. You have converted that low entropy into a high entropy product, which is a, table. The order, the natural order has been changed from a tree to a wooden table. And therefore, if you want to, recycle it, you can never recycle it in a way that the table will convert itself again to a tree. So this is also something is very interesting. What he basically tries to say is that every time you change a natural resource to one order, to second order, to third order, the amount of energy that you use to build that is also very high, and you kind of change it to an extent that you cannot bring back what it was in its original order. And so the key idea here is that there are biophysical limits. If you cut off all the trees to make a lot of tables, you might have a lot of tables, but you may have no trees anymore for not just to make table, but for various other functions that a tree plays. Right? So that is why we call it as applying thermodynamics to economics, because it's about entropy law. Then came Herman Daly. Herman Daly is also known as the father of ecological economics. And in 1970s, if you remember, we spoke about Mill's steady state economy. He also spoke about steady state economy, and he basically mentioned that economy should maintain a stable scale. So for Herman Daly, what was the most important question is the optimal scale. If you remember, we discussed that while neoclassical economists could very clearly tell us that at the micro level, when marginal cost becomes equal to marginal revenue, a firm should stop production, right? But when it is about macro level, there was no scale. And this is where Daly came in, and he mentioned that every economy should actually aim to achieve a steady state where you are able to maintain a stable scale and it does not expand further. Resources, only in that way, resources use of resource would remain within ecological limits. And key idea here again was that growth is not infinite. Economy must stabilize at some particular point. Then the environmental movement in 1960s and 70s, of which we have discussed, where there was a rising awareness of pollution, resource depletion, ecological damage. So this challenged the belief that growth can continue indefinitely without consequences. However, the core idea of this period is that all these thinkers collectively shifted economics by saying that economic activity must respect environmental limits. And this is the foundation of ecological economics as well. So if you look at the institutional development of ecological economics, two major events made ecological economics as a formal field. The first is the launch of the journal, which we call it as the Journal of Ecological Economics. It still exists. It's a very, very well-known journal. If you are interested in the subject of ecological economics, you will find many interesting articles published around, the growth of ecological economics. This is some of which I'm going to also share as reading materials. That's the first one. And second is the formation of International Society for Ecological Economics. Both of these happened in 1989. And there is a Society of Ecological Economics. For example, I'm also a member of the International Society for Ecological Economics. And then there were country chapters also. So we also have something called Indian Society for Ecological Economics. Now, the Ecological Economics Journal, as well as the International Society for Ecological Economics. These all was led by two very well-known ecological economists. One is Robert Costanza and Herman Daly. And this gave the field an academic legitimacy and also a global recognition and helped to formally recognize ecological economics, not just as a subset, but as a new way of looking at economics. Okay. Now let's try to understand how ecological economics is actually defined. Although I have briefly told you that it aims to bridge the gap between the nature or the ecology and the economy, but there are also certain ways of defining ecological economics. So this slide basically is trying to lay the core idea of ecological economics, and it tries to break down the meaning of the words and also relationship between nature and the economy. So if you look at the way it's been defined, by Herman Daly, and the photograph that you see here, which is a book which is called Ecological Economics: Principles and Application. Again, a very important book if in case you are interested to carry forward this subject, then this is a book that you must have or you must buy. This book defines ecological economics as the union of ecological economics and ecology. So it's a union of ecology and economics, basically, right? And this is important because it signals that ecological economics is not just a subfield of economics. It is actually an integration of two disciplines. One is ecology, which allows you to understand how natural system operates, how natural system functions, and while it also helps you to understand economics, that is understanding human systems. And so ecological economics studies both together, not separately, and that is why the name is ecological economics. So while economics is there, you do not segregate them. You try to understand that all of your economic activities, how economic activities depend on the ecology, and how also ecology can get impacted due to your economic activities. So both ecology and economics actually also comes from a Greek word which is called oikos. So what does it mean? It means household. So What ecological economics tries to tell you is that ecology is the study of household of nature, meaning how ecosystems function, such as forest, river, climate systems. And it also tries to tell you economics, meaning management of human household. So one is the household of nature, which is what the ecology studies. And another is the management of human household, like how human produce, consume, allocate resources. So this shared root is like a very powerful conceptual bridge because it suggests that human and nature are a part of the same household. They are not coming from two different systems. So whenever you are talking about anything related to human household, you cannot actually give up or you cannot actually forget the natural household, which is the ecosystem. So this also implies that economy is actually embedded within nature. It is not outside the nature. So this is a very important point to remember. And that is why ecological economics insists that there is a limit, because this limit is actually imposed by the household of nature, that is ecological system, through, because of finite resources and carrying capacity. Okay. Now, it is also important to understand, how all of these built up. If you look at the definition that came up, actually, so one of the definition that I gave you was the definition of Joshua Farley and Herman Daly. But in this slide, what you see here is that this is the definition which came up in the Journal of Ecological Economics, particularly in the first edition. And here they define ecological economics as ecological economics addresses the relationship between ecosystem and economic system. And this is something which is very, very important because it means that you are basically trying to, you're moving beyond just combining ecology and economics, but you're also focusing on the interaction between them and interdependencies between them. So you use the word relationship between ecosystem and economic system in the broadest sense. So therefore, in the earlier relationship, we spoke about study the ecosystem, study the economic system. But here we are saying we try to understand the relationship that they share. So here, therefore, you see that the definition becomes a bit more broad, and it basically says that, there are interactions and interdependencies. It also includes biophysical, social, and institutional dimensions. So it's not just limited to markets or prices like what we discussed in the earlier discussions in neoclassical and environmental economics. So the definition shifts to a kind of a framework. Now, there is also a definition given by the European Society of Ecological Economics, which is more like a normative dimension. So the European Society for Ecological Economics adds actually another layer. It focuses on relationships between ecological, social, and economic systems for mutual well-being of nature and people. So what is new here? It also brings in the society. So it says that it's not again just economy and ecology. There is also something that is society. So because many of our economic activity is also because of our, social demand, because we want it, people want it, right? So you cannot keep that out as well. So we need to also understand the relationship between ecology and society, society and economy, and also the relationship between economy, society, and ecology. So it basically introduces values, goals. It talks about, emphasize these sustainability, equity, and even well-being. So ecological economics is not really a very value neutral concept. It is also very, very normative and policy relevant. That means we also ask what ought to be, what needs to be, and also how policies needs to be relooked or redefined. What is important to remember is that, however, although relatively new, ecological economics is compared to neoclassical economics or classical economics or even environmental economics, it is a relatively, recent field. But as I mentioned in my earlier slide, that it actually draws from the laws of thermodynamics, which is a law of physics, actually. Right. And why it matters. And that was something in the 19th century which came. So that is also a reason why we say that ecological economics is transdisciplinary, because it tries to explain the economic processes more from the concept of energy and material. And that is why they say that the economic processes are not just governed by market, it is also governed by physical law. And especially, as I mentioned, the second law of thermodynamics, which is the entropy law. And what is the most important part of entropy law? It basically says that energy transformations are irreversible. So once you create a kind of an energy, you cannot, destroy that energy, or neither you can reverse it to the old energy. Like I mentioned, if you change the order of a tree to a table, you cannot change it. It is irreversible to bring it back to a tree. And therefore, the more and more such activities happen, the system moves towards more disorder. So just to give you an example, urbanization is considered to be high entropy, meaning from a rural area, when you move to a peri-urban area, which means that you have certain urban characteristics and certain rural characteristics. The rural area was absolutely in order, in the sense a low entropy. Then you move to peri-urban, which is slightly higher. And then when you move to urbanization, you have roads, bridges, all those amenities, but you have destroyed your forest, your waters, bodies, your wetlands, all of those get disturbed. So you have actually moved to a very high entropy, because now you cannot convert your urban areas back to your rural area. It's irreversible. While you can convert a rural area to urban area, you cannot convert an urban area back to a rural area. So something that is very closely attached to ecological economics concept. And like I already mentioned, Nicholas Rogin's entropy law to economics was also something which influenced ecological economics. And also something called Eugen Odum and Howard Odum, they also spoke about, something called systems ecology, which means that economy is a part of a larger ecosystem, and that, we need to focus on how these systems are interconnected. So if you look at ecological, so why am I talking about this? So the foundation of ecological economics is not just coming, from nowhere. The foundation basically comes from various existing discussion, which talks about energy flow, ecosystem functioning, interconnected systems. All of these together actually became the foundation of ecological economics. Then, if you go to who are the main people who basically main key founders of ecological economics, it is very important to remember. So when I spoke about in the earlier slide, when I spoke about, Odum, or when I spoke about Nicholas, they were the one who influenced ecological economics. But who were influenced by them? It was Herman Daly, who is also considered, like I said, father of ecological economics. He actually introduced the idea of steady state economy, something which we will discuss in later, and also emphasized once again the limits to growth and concept of sustainability. Because if you remember, we discussed after the classical economists era ended, we stopped speaking about limits to growth. This was, there was a rebirth of the concept of limits to growth in ecological economics once again. Robert Costanza is also known to be a founder and also the first editor of Journal of Ecological Economics, worked a lot on ecosystem services valuation. So we have a lot of, ecosystem services. For example, a wetland provides us a lot of services. How do we put a value to those? So not like a monetary value, but also something like an aesthetic value. It's always nice to move around when you have a lot of forest. So that's something like you feel happy, you feel, you get fresh air, etc. So that's something like aesthetic value. So how can we ensure that those values are also taken into account when an economic decision is made? So Robert Costanza also helped to institutionalize the field of ecological economics. Then Anne-Marie Jansen is someone who contributed a lot in, particularly in Europe. She is the one who actually built the European Society of Ecological Economics and focused a lot on human nature interactions and sustainability. John Martinez Alier is known for his work on ecological distribution, conflicts linked to ecological, there is a theory called political ecology and environmental justice. All of these came from John Martinez, but these are the four very, very important and scholars who actually are known to be the one who gave the foundation of ecological economics. And as I had mentioned earlier, you see in that picture, the Journal of Ecological Economics is the one which you see in the right side, and in the middle, a lot of people that you see. This was the first Society of Ecological Economics in 1989 when it was formed. This is how it looked like, but now it's a huge, huge society. It has, people across the world has affiliated themselves to this society. Let us look at, how ecological economics relooked at the mainstream economics. The first thing to remember, what was the foundational vision of ecological economics? Because I can understand that till now, it is still not very clear to you that what was the fundamental change the ecological economics brought in the way we look at the economy, environment, or economy, ecology relationship. Now, if you look at this diagram, which is there on your screen, what you see is that we also call this as the neoclassical view of the economy, and we also call this as a black box economy. And I'll tell you why we call it as a black box economy. The diagram basically shows you that economy is a rectangular shape, something which is in between. There's some input going into the economy, then something happens within it, and then you get an output, which is all the services, economic services that we get. So this basically represents how traditional economics, including the World Bank report, there was whatever report came up, particularly the 1992 World Bank report, depicted or showed the economy environment relationship in this way. There is no mention of the term environment. It basically says that as input, labor, capital, resources go in, and goods and services come out. But as if economy is treated like a black box, because what happens inside and its connection to the nature is completely ignored. And what is missing here? We need to ask a few questions. What is missing? Because we do not know what exactly goes as input. Where are those input coming from? Then we also don't know what is happening inside the economy, what the outputs really are, what are we producing, and where does these output go as well? We don't even know that, right? Now, if you remember, I had shown you once a relationship between the firm and the household. There was a firm and a household diagram, right? On one side, you have firm, and on the other side, you have household. So if you look at this diagram, what you actually see is that, so first is household provides their labor and capital. In return, they get money from the firm because they are providing them their labor and also some capital in the form of rent and in the form of wages. They get money from the firms. And what does the firm do with the labor and capital? It then provides the household goods and services. Right. And then firms also gets money in return from the household because households are buying these goods and services. But what is again missing here? The environment is entirely missing. Now, who pointed this out? And so you see the picture of Herman Daly here. So what happened was in 1992, Herman Daly unfortunately died very early. He was only 60 years old. And what happened was in 1992, he was asked to actually, look at a World Bank report. Actually, World Bank used to come up with a report on the economy, environment. I mean, for various topics. That particular year, they decided to come up with a report called Economy and Environment. And that he was not the one who developed that report, but Daly was asked to review the report. And when he reviewed the report, he basically saw these are the diagrams which are included in the report. And he was very disturbed because he felt that, what is this all about? I mean, does it that we are talking about environment, we are saying economy and environment relationship, but in the entire report, there was no mention of environment at all. So what basically Daly did, Daly gave his review comments, and he also very clearly mentioned how you need to relook at this relationship. Okay. So what basically then Herman Daly did, he came up with a new way of explaining the relationship between economy and the environment. And that basically brought the first difference between the conventional way of looking at economy and environment relationship and how ecological economists looked at it. So what did he do? He basically first explained that economy is actually a subsystem of nature. So for the first time, a diagram was entirely reversed. So if you remember in the earlier diagram, what did you see? You saw that economy was the whole and ecosystem was a small component of it. If you remember when I explained to you the neoclassical economics. So Daly basically came in and reversed the entire diagram, and he said that it's other way around. Economy is a subsystem of a larger ecosystem. And the key idea here was that the economy is not independent. It actually exists within the biosphere, within the ecosystem. And since ecosystems are finite, and the economy being a part of this finite system, it obviously cannot grow indefinitely. So thus directly challenging the idea of unlimited economic growth. He also emphasized that, the environmental degradation actually happens because our economic activity has exceeded our ecological limits. If we knew when to stop at the macro scale, then environmental degradation would not have reached where it has reached today. So what does that mean? It means that while nature provides resources in the form of forest, water, minerals, nature also acts as a sink to absorb the waste that we generate. So what are these sinks? It can be air, it can be oceans, it are all, to some extent, these are also rivers. All of these natural resources which are our source also act for us as sinks. But today we are overusing our resources, meaning which is leading to resource depletion, overusing our sources, and we are also overloading our sinks, right? That is why you see today pollution, climate change. So let's take the example of climate change. Excess CO2 emission has happened from our economic activity. So you have taken inputs, resources, you have use them for economic processes. Now you have created a byproduct, which is CO2 emission. Now you do not know where to dump them because you have also exhausted the sink, which is your atmosphere. It cannot absorb so much CO2 anymore. And as a result, what we see today is climate change and breakdown of the natural system. This also shows the mismatch between economic scale and the ecological capacity. Now, why it is so important to remember? Because if we knew when to stop, probably we would have stopped before we reached that ecological limits. Now, also very interesting and important, what you see here is that Herman Daly therefore brought in three key priorities. Now, what are these priorities? Some of these priorities, you will look at it as if it is something similar to neoclassical, but you have to also remember, I have mentioned here in order of importance. This is how he basically explained. So for him, the first thing is scale, which is limits. How big the economy should be relative to nature. This has always remained a big question, and this is a question that we will try to explore, because unless and until we know how much of nature is left or how much an economy can grow, how much nature we have already depleted, if we do not know our ecological limits, then we will always reaching a situation such as the issue of climate change, and we will have to again find a new solution to solve a problem which earlier was never a problem. The second thing that he talks about, distribution, that is equity, not just distribution, meaning you just distributed your resources the way you feel like. Here, the idea is how resources and wealth are shared. Are we using the principles of fairness and justice? The third one is about allocation, which is about efficiency, how efficiently resources are getting used. And this is what the traditional economics also focuses, but ecological economics puts it at the last, at the end. Now, you may ask me, why is it? I mean, efficiency is something that every economist is talking about. So why is that ecological economists are different then? It is different because the way it is putting it in order. For example, in conventional economics, efficiency takes the center stage. The first will be efficiency, efficiency in growth, efficiency in managing market. But for ecological economics, the first is respect the limit. First, you should know the scale. Once you know your scale, we can only produce this much. You need to now focus specifically on fairness, distribution. Once you are able to do that, then you improve your efficiency of allocation. So according to ecological economics, you cannot have efficient allocation if you are operating in a system which itself is unstable or unjust. So the moment you do not define your ecological limit, the moment you do not tell us that, how much you can actually produce, you are already creating an unjust economy or an unjust system. Somebody's resources is getting degraded. Somebody whose livelihood depends on that resource is no longer there. So how can you talk about allocation or efficiency in a system where there is no limit, where there is no, which itself is an unsustainable and unjust system? So this is why we write that this order matters. So the first thing that ecological economics aims to focus is identify the limit to growth, how much we can grow, then talk about equity, distribute whatever you have produced, and then finally, so limit, then equity, and then efficiency. Once you have distributed this, okay, this much will go for services, this one will go for agriculture, this one will go for nature, then you try to bring efficiency within these allocation. So this is something is very, very important, this order for ecological economists. Okay, so what we did today was that we tried to understand the evolution of ecological economics. I think it's kind of clear to you that there is a huge difference between how neoclassical economists particularly looked at the economy itself and how there was a fundamental way of relooking the economy environment relationship, which we also call it as a pre-analytical vision. I mean, the thing is that this was the core for ecological economists, that first is we have to remember that economy is only a subset of a finite ecosystem, and unless we accept that, then we will always feel that we can grow forever. So that was the first challenge that ecological economics made to the neoclassical economics way of thinking. So in the next lecture, I will bring in more about these different fundamental additions and new way of looking at economy environment that ecological economics brought in. Okay, thank you very much.